Hello and welcome to Comic Cuts, the panel show. I'm Kev F Sutherland, the bloke who writes and draws comics for Beano and Marvel and now adapts Shakespeare into graphic novels for kids, and also has a hand in the Scottish Falsetto sock puppet theatre. This is your favourite podcast, which has an occasionally remote connection to comics. Don't worry if you don't know or care anything about comics. Half the time, neither do any of my guests, and it doesn't hurt. My guests have brought with them a panel from a comic or something close, and we're going to see if we can identify it and talk about it. Maybe we and you will learn something about comics we didn't already know, or maybe we'll just show off a bit and have an enjoyable chat. Let's see. Joining me today from the world of comedy, we have Scott Agnew and Mitch Benn.
Yay! Do we clap? Should we clap at that?
Comic Cuts. We're looking at a panel, and we comprise a panel. There's a few of us, so the panel sees a panel, and we talk about the comics from the panel we discuss, and we call it Comic Cuts.
Yes, that was both neat, smooth, and professional.
What we're both known for on the subject.
I've asked everyone on the panel to bring in a panel to the panel. You can see these images on the show page and on the artwork for the podcast episode, depending where you get your podcast from. If you can't see it, say you're driving or some such thing. Don't worry, because we're going to describe them. But first, let's describe ourselves. If you don't know my two guests, well, what's wrong with you? You should. Scott, you are most recently known to the radio listeners from Dead Man Walking. Oh, no, Dead Man Talking. There you go.
Talking, yes.
Got it wrong already. Which sort of describes what it says on the tin, but could you give them a bit more detail of what you mean by that?
I'm officially better than Jesus. I've come back from the dead 3 times. During those lovely COVID times that we were talking about off record, I caught COVID. I self-isolated for 10 days. My first day out of self-isolation, I had a bit of a sore chest. Sat down, had a fag, so I thought, that'll help it.
Made for you right there.
Yeah, it turned out I was having a massive heart attack, and I died 3 times in the back of the ambulance between my local hospital and the Golden Jubilee, which is the best hospital, because apparently if you're going to have a heart attack, the place to do it is in Glasgow, because that's where the world trains, because we have more heart attacks than anywhere else. So genuinely, the Golden Jubilee in Glasgow, as well, like the Mayo Clinic, all your big American private places, they all train there. So so I ended up with a 5 centimetre stent, and I'm here, and it's just terrible, because I assume when you've had a cardiac arrest 3 times in a row, you're probably not much longer for this earth. So I've kind of half-arsed my rehabilitation, because I thought and here I am 5 years later. Do you know? Christ, I might actually live to normal Glaswegian age now.
As long as you make it to the end of the podcast, that's going to be good enough for me. And Mitch, we are always delighted to see you, but from the Radio 4 listeners' point of view, and I hate to bring it all back to Radio 4, we're not on Radio 4, but
neither am I.
for a while,
for nearly 10 years now, and nobody's noticed.
Well, for a while you disappeared, and then when the show that had ridiculously dispensed with you, they had you back for their final episode, because it turned out they couldn't survive without you.
It was not quite the final episode. During that final run, which must be coming up on 2 years ago now, when they finally pulled it.
We're talking about the Now
Show. The Now Show, which it ran from 98 until about 2 years ago, and I was on it from 99 until 2016, which in retrospect is far too long, and I should have quit after about 10 years, because I think basically I probably screwed up my own career by sticking with that show as long as I did, because I'm sure there were opportunities that came and went that I couldn't do anything with because I was signed up to be on that thing forever, and also, I'm not honestly that surprised they got rid of me when they did, because the sheer relentlessness of having to produce material to a decent standard that often, that frequently, and with that little notice, because of course the topical show, you have to kind of leave. It's I'm a terrible one for leaving things to the last minute anyway, but when you do topical stuff, you kind of have to leave it to the last minute, because events You know,
Yeah.
you know, you could the word times, you know, because we had that 24-hour gap between recording it on Thursday nights and it going out on Friday nights. Sometimes something would happen Friday daytime, which would require dumping a massive chunk of the show because something, you know, went from being funny to just not funny anymore, you know. But yeah, they had a final run and they got us all back for one. So I was on one of them. Marcus was on one. John Holmes is on one. You know, everybody from what I like to call the rumors lineup of the Now Show. I love the fact that I don't have to explain that.
We're of a certain vintage. That's
Yes,
what
the rumors, like, you know, not the original, but possibly the definitive. Anyway, but you know,
Which
I love
rather
the
suggests that
never
1998 must have had a Peter Green lineup.
Yeah, well, it was. Well, the thing is, the Now Show was it kind of changed format because it wasn't on in the slot that it ended up in, which is, if you like, the primary satire slot on Radio 4, which is the Friday at 6:30 with the Saturday lunchtime repeat. Right, that when it began, I think was the preserve of the news quiz. And I think Ringers had already started. I think Dead Ringers had already started up a year or so before the Now Show. And then what happened was the Now Show initially was on something, I think, late nights on Tuesdays. I say it was on something in like its own weird slot, but it was also on like 6 months of the year for the first season or so. So I'm for like 13 weeks off, 13 weeks off, 13 weeks away. And then once it got moved to Friday, we were doing fewer of them, but still quite a lot. Still, like usually about 20. You know, like two lots of 8 and a 6. You know, something like or two lots of 6 and an 8. You
I've got
know.
to say, Scott, that you're not a stranger to topical comedy. Of course, you do breaking the news,
do
or
break
you
the
have
news.
done a
Yeah,
lot of.
yeah. I kind of come in. I just kind of get into that just before. What would you call it? Just before COVID. And then, but my background, I was a journalist before I was a stand-up.
Yeah.
So I've always been a kind of news junkie anyhow. And you know, I actually can't believe myself now, which says a lot about how thoroughly miserable the world in the news cycle is, that I can barely bring myself to watch a news program anymore. It's just relentless. But yeah, I never thought I could ever have got bored of the news. Not bored of the news, but scared of the news and
Yeah.
Who can
hidden
buy
from
the
it.
news? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Want to
Because
hide from the damn thing.
they're talking about doing, well, I believe they are doing Saturday Night Live over here. The Americans have always had a different relationship to topical comedy. I get all my news from topical comedy shows over there.
Yes.
Here, it's a dying art.
Well, I mean, there was because I remember that was a conversation that we were always having in the sort of the 90s and noughties. You know, why can't you do the Daily Show here? Why is it impossible to do that? And there were attempts. You know, Marcus did a thing called the Late Edition, which didn't really take in sort of the early noughties.
Yeah.
Part of the problem used to be you could possibly do it more easily now, and not for good reasons. Part of the problem used to be that there's an inversion again between America and Britain, between the way their news media works and the way our news media used to work, which was that their print journalism was all very sober and responsible, whereas their TV news was just spittle-flecked invective. You know what I mean? And ridiculously and proudly biased. Whereas our TV news, until about 5 years ago, was, you know, quite, you know, sober, reflective, and even the ones that, you know, were part of a, you know, and again, this is why, and I used to bang the drum a lot for the BBC. I bang it somewhat less enthusiastically these days because, in particular, their current affairs has gone horribly, horribly sort of polluted with kind of Tory cronyism, and you know, which is a discussion being had at length elsewhere. We need not trouble these good listeners with it. But I think the mere presence of the BBC in our news marketplace kept our TV news fairly sober and responsible, because they'd always have that to be judged against. Whereas, famously, our press, our print media, is again spittle-flecked invective and openly proudly biased. And the thing is, what that meant was, if you actually used to watch The Daily Show, particularly when it was at the absolute height of its powers in the first Jon Stewart era, most of what they did it wasn't so much about the events, it was about the coverage of the events, and that was what Jon Stewart had that we never had, which is Fox News shoveling material at him on an hourly basis. You know what I mean? Because how could you not find something to grab onto when you've got, Sean Hannity's head just spouting this bizarre BS on an hourly basis, whereas we didn't have that. Now we've got it now. To what extent I mean, obviously, I've only ever watched GB News under the most extraordinary duress, and for as little as time as possible. But to what extent it's as richly lampoonable as Naughty's Fox News was, I don't really know. But
I've not actually sat and watched GB News, and I've just reminded myself, I feel a bit like Tristan's parents in George and Mildred when asked if he could turn the telly over to ITV, and I'm thinking, I don't think we've got a button for GB News. I don't actually know where to find it, and blissfully so.
Well, I see it kind of is often sort of pushed at me on Amazon Prime. They clearly have bought a spot that's quite prominent, as if that's Britain's news. So if that's the way Amazon Prime is presented around the world, I'm not entirely sure. When you go into the landing page, if that's what people think British news is, God help what the rest of the world thinks about us.
Yeah, and it possibly is the case because, of course, the things that they see in the rest of the world, podcasts like this, which, hello, international listeners, they get YouTube first, and they get the clips that we all put out on that and TikTok first. And then as for what's going on in the old media, do you know what? Talking of changing the subject, we're here to talk about...
A show to do, kids.
We're here to talk about a very old medium. And, well, we're going to springboard from it, the medium of comics. You've brought in a panel each. We're going to have a look at those. We're going to guess what they're from, and then we'll see where that takes us. And Scott, I'd like to look at the one you've brought in first. So let me see if I can share the image with you. I have zoomed in close on one picture. Can we all see it? Now,
yes, I can see it.
Listeners at home, you should find this on the show page. You should find it on the holding image for wherever you get your podcasts. But don't worry about that because we're going to describe it. Scott, it's your image. So, Mitch, can you describe what you see before you?
What I'm seeing is a man who appears to be wearing either a policeman or possibly a security guard's uniform. He's wearing like a sort of short sleeve blue pilot shirt, but with kind of epaulets and some kind of Sam Brown belt, which makes it look very much like a sort of a military uniform. But it looks like either a sort of, a summer weight American cop's uniform or more possibly a security guard uniform. He is a big burly chap. He's got a kind of flat top crew cut and a little 90s beard, which suggests to me that we could be looking at something 90s here purely on the basis of the facial hair. And he is standing in what all we can see of the room is there is a shelf of books behind him. There is what looks like an open hatch in the ceiling. I have no idea what's going on up there. And he is angrily brandishing a huge red book in a manner suggestive that he's about to smash you in the face with it. And the book it's one of those huge ones with like a gold clasp holding it shut like a sort of a medieval Bible. But legibly on the cover of this book, it is called Haunting Memories of My Favorite Cemeteries. And that's the American spelling of favorite and cemetery. So we're in North America somewhere. And the big guy, as he's about to smash you in the face with that book, is saying in a joint speech bubble, "I'm going to throw the book at you. Hey, what's this?" So evidently he has been interrupted in his book slamming pursuits by some unforeseen circumstance which we haven't got to see yet.
And from my guesswork, based on looking at the line work and the drawing style, the colouring is old-fashioned, almost as if it's been done with watercolour rather than later computer artwork. The line art has an inking style. Again, you're right. I'd nail that to the 90s or the late 80s. And Scott, you shared us a whole page. I've zoomed in on that one image, but I'm now going to zoom out and have a look at the whole page that you shared, which I think will give us a little bit more information. We're now looking at the whole page of comic strip. The panel we just looked up in close with the guy waving the book over his head is the third of 4 panels on this comic strip page. And I now think I start to recognize the drawing style. Mitch, do you?
Well, no, I mean, it is, classic American sort of line drawing block color. But as you're right, the coloring has a sort of rather more subtle edge. It's not that kind of really primary colors 70s DC block coloring, There's an interesting effect in the top panel of suggesting incredibly rapid movement, that we now see that security guard guy is fighting a guy who's wearing what looks for all the world like a WWE wrestling costume.
Yeah.
He has just thrown him on his head, but we see like transparent images of 2 previous stages of this battle, which is quite a nice, there's comic books techniques for depicting action, be it with sort of manga lines or sort of they started to add fake digital blur in the noughties, didn't they?
Yeah.
To sort of action as well. But what they've done here is quite nice. There are 3 different stages, as in sort of WWE guy is shoulder charging security guard guy. He has intercepted that. He has then sort of managed to judo lift him, and now he's body slamming him. So all 3 of those are depicted in the same frame, but the previous 2 are just in transparent line drawings, which is a really nice way of conveying that happened really quickly.
Now, before Scott reveals what he knows about this to us, I'm going to start having a guess at things, because I think the colouring puts it in the 1980s before they had started using Photoshop on everything. I think the line drawing suggests that it's been drawn by Steve Ditko, the artist who created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And this is some of his later artwork from the 1980s. And something that Mitch said that I hadn't even thought of. I thought this is just some security guard guy, and this is some guy in a black outfit I've never seen. I think you've nailed it with the wrestling costumes. I think this is some sort of wrestling comic, and those are both wrestler characters, which is why in the picture we first looked at with the close-up of the guy waving the Haunting Memories of Favourite Cemeteries big red book, it's a quite realistic rendition of his face that's been redrawn by someone, probably not Steve Ditko himself, to look like this guy, because he's a real guy. Mitch, do you want to have more of a guess before Scott tells us?
No, I'm just wondering where the wrestler guy's left leg has gone in that bottom panel.
Yes, it's disappeared. That's a real cock-up. The guy standing full on the ground, his leg goes from his pants down to his thigh,
behind the other guy's leg, and then doesn't re-emerge from behind.
Brilliant.
Well, yeah.
Scott, tell us.
Well, your detective work is pretty much bang on. This is from WWF Battlemania series of comic books, and you're not far out. I believe this was a 1991 production. I don't think there was an awful lot of them, because I only ever remember having had one of these comics, because I think they were relatively difficult to get over here. I don't think there was. I don't think they were. I remember getting one of them and never being able to get the the other ones that were associated with it. But yes, the two that is 2 wrestlers. The guy in the cop's outfit is the Big Boss Man, and the other one is the legendary Undertaker. So.
The Undertaker I've heard of. He was an answer on Only Connect last week.
There you go. Well, the Undertaker, that was so. This was he'd only just appeared in the WWF in about 1990, and this is when he played essentially a dead man who couldn't be hurt, couldn't be So they were all very, very cartoonish, and the big boss man was a correctional facilities guard who strangely was kind of dressed up like a cop from Cobb County, Georgia. And yes, and he I have to say that the artist has been very generous to him because he was a fat man. This is quite a muscular, muscular
If
depiction of him.
if my experience of licensed comics is anything to go by, the person who's being drawn had a say in that. I worked for a while when I was working for Marvel. I worked on Star Trek. We were drawing classic Star Trek with Nimoy and Shatner in, but I knew the guys who were doing the Star Trek: The Next Generation, and
Yep.
Jean-Luc Picard or Patrick Stewart
Yes.
famously contacted them through Marvel Comics and Universal Studios or Paramount and asked if he could be made to look less bald. So, this guy asking for a few pounds to be trimmed off, not unusual.
Not unusual. Well, this is knowing the WWF at this time, because it was Vince McMahon who was the master and commander of that world, and let's just say in recent court filings, it turns out he's got a bit of a thing for his men being muscular. So it's likely Vince McMahon, as the owner of WWF, probably would have asked for that rather than necessarily the performer themselves.
Was Trump involved in this wrestling world at this time?
Yes, he would have been. Trump, because WrestleMania 4 and 5 were at the Trump Plaza in Atlantic City. So Trump and McMahon have been involved since the sort of mid-80s. And then later, I think it was WrestleMania 20, that was the Battle of the Billionaires, where McMahon and Trump picked, interestingly, two ethnic minority wrestlers to fight one another as their proxies, right? And the loser would get their head shaved. So obviously it was McMahon that his wrestler lost, and McMahon had his head shaved. But that's also if you've seen the meme where Donald Trump clotheslines a guy beside a wrestling ring. But this is why there's lots to be suspect about the Trump movement and the MAGA movement being very, very much influenced by what happens and how wrestling portrays itself, the idea of kayfabe, things that are possibly real but not real, and it just always playing with that idea of reality, and also the call and response stuff. Those having 3-line slogans that people can chant backwards and forwards, how to get people booing for someone. It's all straight out of WWE.
So wait, the playbook for modern politics is from wrestling.
Me and a few other. I'm not the first person who've had that theory. A few folk have had that kind of theory. Even down to the notion that some people say, and I'm going to use a Trumpism. Some people say that him being shot in the ear was staged. It was false. You know.
Get out of here.
and it's for wrestlers that are trying to simulate, having been cut open, they would blade in the ring. They would take a little razor that they kept concealed somewhere on their person, and some would say that what happened to Donald Trump's ear kind of looks like a pro wrestling blading.
Well, remember where you heard it first.
An extraordinarily perceptive and not in the least bit comforting insight, Scott. Thank you.
I know. As I say, some people might say, I'm not saying I say it. Some people might say, but yeah. So that was This was kind of I kind of got into WWE about this time, and I was an absolute sucker for basically anything that they could sell. Because I wasn't particularly into kind of, I wasn't particularly into superheroes as such. Like I didn't massively get into that. But the fact I've got a kind of thing about realism. I like things feeling quite real, and these were real people who were playing sort of superhero. Who were, I could see them doing these things. So that was kind of my connection with it.
You're saying this is 1991. You're just reminding me of the comic that I did in 1992. I watched, it was a TV show I wouldn't have been watching myself, but I watched it with some cousins, and I saw for the first time Gladiators. And I thought they would make superheroes. So I did it. Somewhere on the shelves behind me is Gladiators comic. I went to LWT. I had a publisher who I'd been working with. I brought them along. We went to LWT. We got the license to turn Gladiators into a superhero comic. So all the gladiators were given superhero powers. Their pugil sticks were, lightning would have lightning coming out of it. The atmospheres, they would fly round in these atmospheres. We commissioned the artwork for 3 full issues and a little bit more. They published 2, then realized they were losing tons and tons of money, so stopped it. I lost a fortune, and well, a small fortune, but certainly I lost my income really badly at the time. And yes, we didn't publish any more of those comics. But yeah, at the time, what a great idea!
Yeah, it was a huge idea, and I was a sucker for Gladiators. God, I remember having the Gladiators soundtrack CD to it, and that was, and actually that, because there was a lot of good kind of rocky sort of music involved in that kind of, there was AC/DC, well, I mean, so, but no, there was some, I got introduced to some decent music via the medium of the Gladiators, but yeah, so that I was a sucker for that. Maybe the fact that I'm homosexual, there was something that appealed to me about muscular men and speedos and baby oil and lycra. I don't know, but I certainly I connected with it at 12 years of age anyhow.
The appeal is widely clear. The idea of spin-off comics, that was something that I think people still think that might be a thing, but
Gladiator's back, you should get in there.
Yeah, I don't think people have ever bought spin-off comics in my opinion, because now
I might because I was thinking this, you're probably going to think I was like desecrating the whole idea of comics, because and it wasn't until later on in life I realized. So I loved, if you remember, the Thundercats cartoon.
Yeah,
I adored the Thundercats cartoon Mask, which was a kind of I loved Mask. And I remember having spin-off comic books of those cartoons, and then I realised they weren't sort of based from anyone's imagination. It was just Hasbro or whoever the toy manufacturer was kind of went, we need a big series of toys, and they needed a cartoon to sell the toys, as opposed to the cartoon. The toys were a spin-off from the cartoon.
Yeah, I mean, certainly at this time there were a lot of spin-off comics. I remember things like there was the Ghostbusters cartoon on TV, and then they made that into a comic, and there was loads of that kind of stuff. And I remember the Mask comic, and Cartoon Network, whenever they'd make a thing, there'd be a series of comics. The American comics probably sold well, but they'd try and make them for the newsstands over here, and they would just...
really?
Yeah.
It's strange that that never translated like that. But that, I mean, I remember these, like the Battlemania comic, feeling dead exotic because it had a door sign in the front, and I was which would have been unusual compared to other.
It had what on the front?
A door sign on the front.
Oh yeah, right. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. So that felt really exotic and exciting. And I thought, nobody else will have had this because it's been flown in, especially from America for me.
Well, how fantastically exotic. That was WrestleMania, the spin-off comic drawn, as far as we can tell, by Steve Ditko, of whom I assume, Scott, you know little and care less, the name Steve Ditko.
No, I have. I rather embarrassingly found myself in a pub. I was doing a gig in Money Hive, in the Dumfries Borders direction. Yeah,
I think I know where you're going.
And I can remember the night. Tyson Fury was fighting Klitschko, and it was on the TV. We're all kind of crowded. We were doing a gig in the next room in this, I think it was at Glendara Hotel. That might be Take the High Road, but anyway. And I get chatting to this nice man, and somebody kind of went, "You do know who he is, don't you?" And I went, "I have no idea." Was it Frank Miller that done Judge Dredd?
Frank Miller could have been there. Alan Grant would definitely have been there because he was the guy who ran the Moniaive Festival and lived in Moniaive. He's sadly passed since then.
Right.
But Alan Grant was the guy who was a long-time writer on Judge Dredd and Batman. And,
Right. Well, I think it was
Scottish creator. And he invited loads of Americans to Moniaive.
Well, I think it was Alan Grant. Then it was because I was told that's the guy that does Judge Dredd, you know, and so I was sort of right because I briefly flirted with Judge Dredd in my kind of later teens, but never quite got on board, unfortunately. But
I'm where you are now. When I go to these comic festivals, they have in the intervening years since I was bigly into comics, and I still work full time in comics. But it's not like when you're a teenager and you're 20 something, you're consuming everything. They keep producing new creators, and they keep producing new comics. So the room is full of all these people who I have to be told are famous because they just don't look old enough to be famous.
I know it's kind of looking at a running order at a gig these days, and you kind of go, "Who?" You're like, oh, they won such and such. Oh, did they? All right, okay. Well, no.
Well, we're going to have a look now at what Mitch has brought in. Mitch, I've zoomed in on a small bit of the panel you brought with us.
I've been niche and culty, but you know.
Well, let's have a look at the zoom in before we pull back. And listeners at home, you'll be able to see this on the show notes and blah, blah, blah. Scott, tell us what you see.
Oh, this kind of feels like a Rorschach drawing, as if this looks quite dark, quite demonic. It's black and white. It looks like a kind of almost like an ink print. Do you know a screen print? I think. I'm trying to say now. There's sort of what looks like. Yes, it kind of looks like a head, but with possibly a fin or a scale where an ear would be. Is this right? But it looks as if there's been some kind of impact because there's like a blowback. You know, it looks like the JFK assassination at the back there on the right hand side of the panel. There's lots of bits and pieces flying out. It looks like a very nice, and you know, depending on your viewpoint, there's like some kind of like, oh, what would you call it? A trap, an animal trap, but used as an accessory. So very gay. That's like on a sort of shoulder pad sort of thing. I think that's. But I don't know entirely what I'm looking at.
Well, that's
a grill where a face should be in.
It is unfair that I've cropped in so close, but when you see the wide picture, you'll see why I've done it. Now, I know what this is from, but for the benefit of the listeners at home who can't see it, what we're looking at is something like a biker's helmet, only the guy has got a grill in the front with vertical slats instead of anything you could see through. It's got wings on the side like bat wings. There's a hole being punched through this biker's helmet by, when you look closely, you can see a fist with gloves on. The guy wearing the biker's helmet has got big shoulder pads in, which do look like they've got teeth that would form a man trap. And you know, when you're talking about the bondage gear and when you're talking about the leather and padding, I think we know where you're coming from. We're going to have a look now at the wider picture and see if this gives you, Scott, more information. What do you think you're looking at now?
Well, right, okay, right. It all makes perfect sense. So it is Judge Dredd fisting somebody. No,
and that goes into the trailer.
No, it does say, you know, gaze into the fist of dread. I mean, just arrange those words. Gaze are into the fist of dread. But
it's spelled you're laughing, yeah.
So yeah, we've got Judge Dredd punching somebody right in the pus. You know, so hard that his fists come right through the back. I don't know who the other character is. I mean, it's a gorgeous bit of art. It's very kind of. It's got that kind of communisty, Soviet kind of feel to it, hasn't it?
I'll tell you who the artist is. The artist is Brian Bolland, who has been a guest on this very podcast. Listeners, you can check us out in the season 1. Brian Bolland was a guest and see what he brought in. He drew this picture about 1979, I'm guessing. Well, Mitch is going to fill us in with the details. The guy who's been punched in the face is, I know, a dark judge. There's 4 or more dark judges. I think they're based on the old Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but they're from Judge Dredd's science fiction world. And yeah, the lines of that drawing, they're like a Dürer etching, aren't they? They're like a medieval lino cut or woodcut print. They're not drawn that way. They're drawn with a hand and a brush on Bristol board, I should imagine. But such a crisp, powerful bit of artwork. There's no messing around, is there? It's dynamic. He's got extra dynamic lines coming in from the front. That voice bubble, I can even tell you, I think, who lettered that voice bubble. I think he's lettered by a chap called Tom Frame. Back in the days when your voice bubbles were done by hand by a chap who sat in the corner of the office in King's Reach Tower in London, where I visited them at about the time as a kid. And this is from Judge Dredd in 2000 AD. Mitch, tell us more.
Like I said, I thought I could try and be niche and culty and catch us all out. But then when I saw that Brian Bolland had been a guest on this podcast, I thought, I'm going to go with what is widely considered to be the single greatest frame in comic book history. I couldn't give you the exact date. I think it was a bit later than that because I was ever so slightly late to the party 2000 AD wise. I didn't get into it until 79. It began famously at the beginning of 77. I got into 2000 AD around the middle of 79 when I was 9 years old. The guy who got me into 2000 AD was a school friend of mine who you may have heard of, Stephen Brotherston. He's half of Scarred for Life.
Yes.
Yeah. You know those guys who do those books about paralyzingly terrifying children's TV from the 70s and 80s that messed our entire generation up for the rest of the time. Well, Steve was at Dovedale County Primary School with me in Liverpool in the 70s. Stephen, although he keeps this a bit quiet, was the most naturally gifted sketch artist I ever met. He could draw like this when we were 8. In fact, we used to do comics together when we were at primary school. I used to write them. He used to draw them. I don't know what became of any of them. But he was the one who was always ranting about 2000 AD. I don't know why it took me as long to get hold of as it was, because obviously 2000 AD is so, particularly at the time, so much up my alley. It was everything I was obsessed with. I love comic books. I love science fiction. The formatting of 2000 AD was brilliant because, of course, it was almost like a sci-fi TV channel in printed form.
Yeah.
Because what you would have, for start, one of the things I love, I found a colorized version of this. I thought, no, we want the original black and white line drawings. The only bits that were color were the outside covers and the center spread. Everything else was black and white. And that's one of the reasons why 2000 AD ended up revolutionizing the American comic book industry, is it wasn't just that all, because as Brian said in the episode he was on, the money you got over here was nothing, and you had to sign all your rights away. So you basically weren't making anything over here. So obviously all the best writers and artists was being sort of lured away by the sort of DC Vertigos of the world. And, that's why you have John Constantine now, and that's why you have so much of the stuff that was really good in American comics from the sort of the mid-late, and that's why you have Watchmen, those two, Alan and Dave are absolutely 2000 AD guys. But one of the things about it, of course, if you look at Brian's artwork, Brian was almost a celebrity artist even within 2000 AD terms, because his art is so meticulous that, as he pointed out on that podcast, he kind of ended up being kept back for doing special occasion covers because his stuff was so meticulous. He took twice as long to draw it as everybody else did.
Yeah.
I think it did make me laugh on his podcast when who said, yeah, well, that's why you never bothered doing backgrounds.
It was Kevin and Nick that accused him of not doing backgrounds.
Yeah, it was. I can't remember one of the other 2000 AD artists accused him of never bothering to do backgrounds. He would put so much time and effort into the figures That we just put them against, like as you see here, is almost against a black void. But what we're seeing here is this is the second of the Dark Judges stories. Judge Death was introduced in a one-off story of his own not long after I jumped aboard. So that would have been, I think, about 1980. This, I think, is about 1981. When Judge Death, there is a power. This is when the first time you started to get metaphysics in Judge Dredd. Heretofore, it had all been fairly hard sci-fi. If you've seen either of the two movies, you get the idea of what the setup of Judge Dredd is. Post nuclear war, the only habitable bits of America left, bizarrely, are the urbanized coastal areas, which of course actually would be the first bits to get destroyed, ironically, if it actually happened. But all the survivors are now huddled into these vast cities that essentially go along the coast. So the whole of the East Coast is now Megacity 1, the whole of the West Coast is now Megacity 2, and the whole of the South is now Texas City, and these massive fortified conurbations, and the entire middle section is now the cursed earth, and is this radioactive desert that nothing can survive. In due course, which is quite fun, you discover the rest of Judge Dredd's world. You get to meet the Brit judges, and also hilariously the Irish judges, who are just the Irish judges are just fantastic when you get to meet them. But in this, Judge Death sort of seeps through from some parallel dimension in which the judges have gone so berserk they've outlawed life. And Judge Death is literally this zombie wearing a kind of hideous mutation of Judge Dredd's own uniform, just going around sucking the life out of it. They've discovered this parallel dimension, i.e. the dimension of the comic books, where there is still life, and they've come to eradicate it from this dimension as well. And Judge Death ends up being confined inside the mind of Judge Anderson, who is the most famous psychic judge. One thing about Judge Dredd is telepathy is a thing, whether it's meant to be some kind of post-nuclear mutation telepathy but telepathy is definitely a thing. And there's an entire branch of the judges, the side judges, devoted to developing their psychic powers. And the most powerful of them was Cassandra Anderson, and she ends up in a sort of Father Karras from The Exorcist mode of sucking Judge Death into her mind, and then get confined forever in this substance called boing. This is one of the things about Love of their most frivolous elements and their darkest elements would be combined in the same stories. Boing had been introduced a few episodes previously as this illegal hobby whereby you spray yourself with this stuff called boing, and it instantly inflates and turns you into like one of those gladiators' atmospheres. So you are sealed inside an enormous bouncy ball, and you can then hurl yourself off. And the only place it's legal to do this is a place called the Palais de Boing, which is essentially a football stadium-sized pinball machine that you can now hang yourself off all the surfaces of. But of course, the illegal boingers are doing it in the street and causing havoc, smashing into buildings and causing car crashes. So there was a whole episode about illegal street boinging. And then in Judge Death, Judge Anderson sort of, confines Judge Death's, essence within her mind, and then gets sealed in forever in boing. So it's meant to be this great sacrifice that she's made. But anyway, in the sequel, it turns out that Death is only one of, as Kev points out, essentially the 4 judges of the apocalypse. And his 3 pals come looking for him. They being Judge Mortis, who is decay, Judge Fire, who is fire, and we see here Judge Fear, who is fear. And the way Judge Fear gets you is, you can see from his helmet, there's sort of the front grille of his helmet opens up like 2 little gates. And the way he gets you is he just grabs you and goes, "Gaze into the face of fear," and the gates pop open, and whatever you see in there instantly drives you out of your mind, right?
Ah,
That's the way Judge Fair gets you. But of course, one of the running themes of Judge Dredd is that Judge Dredd, while he is not in any respect superhuman, he has nonetheless developed superhuman levels of self-control. And there's famously an episode in which the whole of Mega City 1 gets infested with these mutant fleas that can't be killed by anything. So the whole city's just plagued by scratching fits. And Dredd is just stomping around in the middle of it all. And at one point, somebody says, "How come you ain't got the fleas, Judge?" And he says, "I've got the fleas. I'm just not scratching."
The wonderful thing about this, the era of 2000 AD that we're discussing there, is that it predates anything else. There weren't the video games and there weren't the big budget CGI movies. So this was the only place where this sort of level of imagination could be exposed on the page. And at the time, the Americans weren't doing anything as wacky as that. The Americans would tend to say, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't be silly as well as being." And so our imagination in the UK in 2000 AD in particular, we got carried away with things that the Americans then opened up to when we exported the talent.
Kev, could I quibble with you just a little moment? Right.
Yeah.
I've just listened to Mitch's description of the Palais de Boeing, and that in Scotland is known as Airdrie, right? and those mutant fleas, they're known as midges, right?
And I'll tell you the other thing, Scott. Judge Dredd, Scottish. John Wagner, the lead writer and creator, and Alan Grant, the co-writer, both Scots. And the Scottish sensibility runs through. You've got this kind of Ur Wally world that they live in that plays a big part of the not taking it too seriously while also going well over the top in a way that...
The sense of humor in Judge Dredd is absolutely essential. That's why I still don't think there's been a definitive Judge Dredd movie, because, you know, when the Carl Urban one came out, we went, "Oh, thank God it's not trying to be funny." And so the trouble with the Sly Stallone one wasn't that it was full of jokes, it was full of terrible jokes. Well, Carl Urban one had like 2 jokes in it, which were quite well done. The one where like the kid points the gun out and says, "Freeze, Judge," and he just stands and says, "Why?" And that's a perfect Judge Dredd response. Judge Dredd was full of jokes. This really bleak sense of humor runs through the whole thing. So what's obviously happened here is, you know, Judge Fear has confronted Judge Dredd. The mask has popped open. He's given it the whole gaze into the face, fear thing. And Judge Dredd has just stood there and gone, "Whatever, smashed it."
And the influence that we see from these, when you say about the movies that have been made, the trouble with making a Judge Dredd movie was the things that were made before it. Both Mad Max and RoboCop were Judge Dredd. They had so much Judge Dredd, so much stuff that had come, and the creators admitted that the influence on the second Mad Max film, the third Mad Max film, and RoboCop right from the start came from these comics. And Fallout the game, which I wasn't familiar with, but I've been catching up with Fallout the TV version that's done on Amazon, and that is for me Judge Dredd and the Cursed Earth.
Absolutely. I mean, it just is. I mean, that's one of the kind of the same problem that they used to have with Dune, which they finally got around, which is that all the really cinematic elements had already turned up in other hit movies. You know, that's the thing. All the really cinematic elements of Judge Dredd, you know, like, you know, the city more or less turned up in Blade Runner. You know, just so much of it has already turned up in other movies. But I mean, this, you know, is just magnificent. And like I say, one of the other things I loved about 2000 AD is format-wise, it was almost like a TV channel, because the only strip that absolutely ran with no breaks and never stopped is Dredd. Dredd never, as far as I know, I mean, my sort of real devoted period to 2008 was 79 to about 91, 92, when I started spending a lot of time out the country because I was a languages student. So I was and I missed a whole year. And when I came back, I kind of felt that it had gone off the rails a bit. And I was quite encouraged to see the documentary they made about 10 years ago, Future Shock, and to discover that, the general consensus was that 2000 AD lost the plot a bit in the early 90s. And I said, "Oh, okay, thank heavens it wasn't just me." Because I found it kind of harder to get back into, and I got back in. But I never missed one for the whole of the 80s, which is this absolute halcyon period. And you would have things like, they adapted the stainless steel rap books.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really audacious, but and adapted them as one of their weekly strips. So they're just doing it like 8 pages at a time, but they did three, I think, of the stainless steel rat books. And they were drawn by the great Carlos Esquerra, who I never met. I just missed him at the one Comic-Con I ever went to, which I think was 2014. I just missed Carlos Esquerra, the guy who designed the Judge Dredd costume. And actually, you're right. He didn't do Dredd for a long time and then got back into doing Dredd at the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
Carlos Esquerra just had the most fascinating art style. You look at Brian's stuff here. Brian was the most photorealistic of all of them. Also, Brian's characters have the most magnificent range of facial expressions. Brian's characters overact better than everybody else's, There was another guy who did a lot of Dredd at the time called Ron Smith, who had a weird kind of 1950s look to his figures, but the most mind-bending cityscapes. He loved his backgrounds. So whenever you got Ron Smith, he always got the best Mega City one. He drew the best Mega City one. And Carlos Esquerra, everything Carlos Esquerra did was dots. He painted, he like one of those guys who's lost the use of his arms and paints with his mouth. That's what Carlos looked like. It was all dots. But in particular, he adapted the stainless steel rat. And I'm fairly sure, without asking him, cast James Coburn as Jim DeGritz.
pretty well looked like that. Yeah, he did have that.
He
that
just
great
gave
look.
him James Coburn's head, right? Who would I have if this was a movie? It'd be 1960s Flint era James Coburn. Right, we're giving him James Coburn's head. I often wonder if anybody ever told James Coburn that. You do realize you're playing Jim DeGritz in a British comic strip right now.
Looking at the Judge Dredd, Brian Bolland picture that we've got here, it brings us back to one of the early observations you made, Scott, of the homoerotic nature of this leather and well, the big and the padded. There's iconography, which is unusual for these comics because they're made mostly by straight creators. You get a lot of queer creators and you get a lot of female creators now, but back then, mostly straight creators.
I can see a lot of Tom of Finland sort of in that, and that's kind of sort of a gay man's eye on ridiculous overt masculinity. And I wonder if it's just men's idea of how they kind of perceive themselves or what they think an ideal is. I don't know, and that's true for gay or straight men. I don't know, that kind of big chest, broad shoulders, and fucking tight fitting uniforms. But I think there's a bit of there's a wee kind of fascist streaking off on all men.
Well, that's a funny crossover thing, isn't it? Because the leather uniforms, the broad shoulders, and these are being done by straight creators for kids as well. But they're drawing on different things and interpreting them in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, generally the kind of the idea about what gay men fetishizes is generally end up fetishizing their fears, so which is why kind of like the sort of Ned's Charles Scally kind of look, because those were the kids that would have beaten you up at school, so that became a big thing. And like football kit and stuff like rugby kit, because those lads wouldn't have included you, and similarly so with sort of police and army uniforms, because those are places you weren't welcome. So that's as a very sort of general rule of thumb, you fetishize what you came to fear, because we know that kind of line between pleasure and pain is a very kind of sort of narrow one. So what a maybe straight man sees as this big strong authority figure, with all the power, well, like, yes, to do, but a gay man would look at that and go, oh, that's all the things I'm scared of, and I either need to assimilate and look like that, or can I subvert it and be me but still look like that?
Like the whole sort of the way the Brighton gay scene adopted the skinhead look in the 80s.
Absolutely, yeah, totally. That was entirely the reason that kind of happened. That it was like, we're going to subvert that, and the punk movement kind of did it as they took that kind of the racist skinhead thing and turned it in his head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is fascinating. It is, but I mean, yeah, because the thing about Yeah, but one thing you do, you kind of take for granted that kind of incredible physiques in comic books. And the only time that really occurred to me was when I was at Comic-Con and you realize just how terrible superhero costumes look on normal bodies.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, God, if you've ever seen anybody fancy dressing as Asterix or Tintin, I mean, Asterix, he's got a wee dress, he's got pigtails. Tintin is ginger. I mean, it's a non-starter.
Yeah,
I never thought about Asterix, but I have occasionally thought about dressing up as Obelix.
I can see,
Now, we have gone over the time I said I'd keep you for, but I'm going to end up with the wee picture that I've brought in myself. We don't need to devote too much time to this, but let's see what you make of the cropped in image from this. Who would like to have the first go at describing this?
Okay. It basically looks like everything that you should absolutely not draw. Aliens that basically look like circumcised dicks with incorporated buttholes.
Yeah, I certainly, if it was attached to me, I would be consulting my GP. Which is, it looks, it looks like kind of an all-in-one hairy ballsack dick.
Yes.
Situation, isn't it?
Being fought off by some kind of, future space hero because there's a hand at the edge of the frame with a very 1950s looking laser pistol trying to fend them off. The lettering at the bottom of the frame puts me in mind of Fat Freddy's cat.
Well, let's see the full page because I was zooming in on a little bit of it. When we see the whole page zoomed out, we will see in context a superhero firing at these phallic creatures.
Yeah.
Can you guess, both of you, given your day jobs, they have come across this artist. Can you guess who this might be?
Oh my God.
Well, the only one I could think of was Simon Donald off the top of my head, but
well, it's from
that doesn't look. It looks far-fetched.
From longer ago than this. This is
something very disturbingly Dr. Seuss about the alien's fingers.
There is a bit. Well, this artist,
isn't it? Yeah.
He signed himself as Ramon, R-A-M-O-N, and the M-O-N is part of his name. He went on to become a stand-up comedian in the 1950s, working right through. I saw him perform at the Edinburgh Fringe in, would it be the late 90s, when he was